Hey everyone, welcome to Pages of Lore from Azeroth, a weekly podcast where we choose a in-game book or object and read about it and talk about its lore and what that means for you and your characters. I'm your host, Mr. Island of the Core Roleplayers Guild. Before we get into today's topic, there's a couple of things I would like to go over with everyone. So first off, you may hear a change in quality on the microphone regarding the last two episodes to this episode. That is because I have found out, actually I was told by other podcasters, that if I come closer to the mic, I sound better. And here we are. You guys are going to have to forgive me. I'm very new to podcasting. I'm incredibly new to editing. If anybody out there listening to this follows me on Twitter, you will see how I basically Rick Mitchell myself into editing. If you don't know who Rick Mitchell is, it's a character from The Mitchells versus the Machines. And as a father of two, I gotta say, I love the movie. I really do. And some slightly less important news than the quality of my microphone, I have moved myself into my laundry room. I have actually pretty much always been in here, but I have now turned a section of my laundry room into a proper place to record with a desk and with actual things on the walls to help keep sounds from bouncing everywhere. Before this, I just had like a little tiny table in here. It wasn't like a sitting table. It was sort of like, it was a nightstand table that I used to keep on the side of my bed. And I brought it in here and shoved it into a corner. That's where I would do all my work. Since it was at knee level and not actually like up so I could speak into it, I had to hold my microphone in my hands for the most part and just sort of speak into it. I would have to be super careful. I would make so much noise just holding my microphone. Now the only thing I have to worry about at the moment is how much everyone is going to hear me breathe in and breathe out. The more important news to go over is that you may notice that there's a slight change in title for the podcast. Originally, the podcast was called The Core Roleplayers Guild, but there is a problem with that. The Core Roleplayers Guild is not an in-game guild. It is my idea of a hub for people who are just creative when it comes to role-playing, people who like to roleplay, people who want to tell stories, for people who just want to experience that life. It felt really odd to call the podcast the Hub's name and not give the podcast its own legitimate name. I know right now the podcast is so young and just so not known that it really doesn't matter, but I just wanted to be there for clarification purposes. And the last thing to talk about before we actually get into the book itself is that I want to try to make the story have a little bit more atmosphere to it. I want to not only tell you a story, I want to show you a story. So it's my goal just to make the next episode a little bit better than the last episode and keep trying with that. And with everything out of the way, we can actually finally start talking about the book this week. Today we're reading Account of the Raising of a Frostwyrm. The hulking bones were nearly swallowed by the snow, but there was no mistaking the grim claw that jutted upward, twisted in solemn agony. The necromancers assembled without a word, forming a ring around the dragon's corpse. They stood still for a moment as the wind encircled them with gusts of snow. Then the ritual began. Spokes of unholy light emanated from the center of the frozen bones, crackling through the snow and ice until at last the immense remains were fully exposed. With a gesture from Grand Necrolord Enitok, the bones shuddered and lurched above the ground, rotating slowly into place. The necromancer's incantations swelled as they began forcing sentience into the creature's remains. Violent contortions racked the body as the worm's consciousness fought against its corrupt reanimation. A thin shriek pierced the air and the beast was subdued. An icy glow ignited within its gaping ribs, spreading along its limbs and lending an eerie cognizance to the sockets of its eyes. The Grand Necrolord came forward and spoke. The Lich King has seen fit to raise you to serve the Scourge. You will be our loftiest instrument of death, raining torment upon the villages of our enemies, feasting upon the living, and bearing our finest Death Knights. The frost worm regarded them and dipped its head slightly in accord. The conversation was complete. Rearing back, it flared its wings like a fan of knives across the sky. Again, just for clarity reasons, that was the account of the raising of a frostworm. I get so tongue-twisted saying that. The book has been in the game for a long time, and you can find it within the heart of Arceus and Death's Breach and the Scarlet Enclave. The first thing I have to really admit, I saw this book in-game and I've never read it. I've made a Death Knight, I've played through the beginning areas. To be honest, I have just never written the book. And my excuse was, I thought that this was the same exact telling that you would see in the Wrath of the Lich King cinematic, so I just never cared. Do you remember the cinematic from way back when? It was like 11 years ago. Wrath of the Lich King came out. You can hear Arthas' father speaking in the background. He says something about restraining your power, and then Arthas proceeded to just not restrain his power and say, "You work for me now, dragon," as he rose that big bad boy, our girl, I don't know, it's dead, big bad dragon up from the grave. And that dragon just took off across the army, and the army all lit up that noise. I'm fairly sure that's what the Scourge sounds like. It's been a while. So going back and watching that cinematic and reading this book, it's clear that this is not the same exact raising. This is not the same exact dragon. At least I do not believe so. I can't find anywhere where it is the same exact dragon, which isn't to say that it's a problem. Arthas, as a Lich King, had many frostworms underneath his command. Now, this book specifically talks about necromancers and the undead. The reason why I'm bringing this up is for those role players who are new or just do not think about it too much or are worried about making other people upset. The classes that you have in World of Warcraft are not the classes that your character can be. Matter of fact, your character isn't actually a class. Your character is a character, and that is it. Just because you are forced to pick a class for your character at the start of the game, an example, a dwarf warrior, does not mean that you are limited to that role while role-playing. Your dwarf warrior is actually a dwarf archaeologist, or a dwarf scientist, or a dwarf blacksmith. Quite literally, the quote-unquote class of your character is completely up to you. Another reason why I bring this up is because sometimes you will see somebody hold too much stock into what your character is. And you actually might have fallen into this trap yourself. You could have, an example, had your character emote and say they looked at this, again, dwarf warrior, when in actuality it's not a dwarf warrior, it was a dwarf necromancer. Go figure. I have seen people get hung up on other players' classes when that's not the point of the character. The class that you see people in their TRPs or whatever is just for them to kind of broaden their character out a little bit, to add more flavor to their character. My takeaway on this book being about necromancers, while you do not see an actual necromancer class except for Death Knights, is that people like to roleplay different things, and that's okay. You're allowed to as well. Get creative. Be interesting. One of my favorite classes I've ever seen was a Draenei mage, but she actually wasn't a mage. She was a scientist. She was enslaving elementals to study them. Moving on down into the book, I think my favorite part was the third paragraph. This is the part where it was talking about the violent contortions and the worm's consciousness and how it was fighting against the corrupt reanimation. And I think that is such a cool little aspect of the lore. I mean, can you just imagine that in a scene? You go up to a Forsaken and you're trying to take over its body. I don't know if this book is trying to say that the body needs to be just flat out dead, or if the body needs to be dead in the same way that the Forsaken are dead, or that the Death Knights are dead. If you are a necromancer, I would highly suggest that you communicate with a Forsaken before you tried to pull a stunt like this. Remember, always communicate with the other players. I mean, it is you and them coming together to make a story. It is very important to communicate. I'm just thinking about it. Just imagine that scene where a necromancer comes up to a Forsaken or a Death Knight or something that is dead, trying to subdue it with necromantic powers. That is so crazy. And it would create a cool scene just for everybody involved. Oh man, and just imagine if the necromancer won the struggle, then had a Death Knight or a Forsaken like following the round as a bodyguard. That could create this whole quest, like this whole storyline for other characters. It's like figuring out, well, why is this human Death Knight, who I've cared deeply for since he was released from the Scourge, no longer acting the way he normally would, besides for, being a Death Knight? I'm just saying that probably has a lot of potential for a good story hook, good character development. I'm excited. If someone does this out there, please tell me how it goes. Grand Necrolord Antioch, I really hope I said that right when I was reading the book. Antioch, he is a character that you can kill. He gives you the scythe. You need the scythe for one of the quests. That's all he does. That's all he's there for. You stab him, you get the scythe, you go do the quest. That's it. Besides for that, there's no additional lore. Besides for this book, he is not mentioned anywhere else in the game. He is here just to be Grand Necrolord Antioch. I think that if you are somebody who is role-playing a necromancer, or even somebody who is role-playing a undead character, like a Forsaken or a Death Knight or anything in between, because there's lots of gray area right there. Especially with Shadowlands out, there are just so many gray areas right there. I really think that this book can help you when it comes to learning about the necromantic school and how it affects others, how it affects the NPCs, how it could potentially affect other players, but most importantly, how it can help teach consent and permission and role-playing. Role-playing isn't just about having a super powerful character who goes off and wins at role-playing. No. You need to think about others while you're here, because you're sharing this huge playground with other people. That's the whole point of it. When it comes to NPCs, it doesn't matter too much, especially if they are your NPCs, because in the book itself, it states that the dragon was fighting the consciousness, or its consciousness was fighting its corrupt reanimation. So we know that the ritual wasn't consensual. Oh God. That's going to be the title of this episode. But the ritual was not done in consent, and therefore the worm's consciousness fought against it. The same thing could happen with the NPCs, and your character could lose that fight. That's another good story hook right there. Your necromancer could have lost a fight. I'm not entirely sure what would happen after the ritual fails, after the consciousness wins. Does it come back anyway and attack the necromancer and then just stay there and die, or does nothing happen at all and the worm's body just stayed dead? And as I sat here and thought about it, is it even possible for the ritual to fail after a certain point? Once the consciousness is there, has the ritual just succeeded and it's going to come back? It's difficult to say, because it specifically says that the conversion was complete after the Necrolord spoke to the worm. Like I said earlier, I think for anybody who is role-playing a undead character or a necromancer, this book asks some interesting questions about the lore. Anyways, I'm going to close this book for now. As always, I really appreciate you guys listening, and let me know how this episode turned out as opposed to the last two episodes. If you like what I did here, then feel free to join me on Discord. I'll provide a link in the description. You can also follow me on Twitter at the Core RP Guild. Feel free to ask me any sort of questions. If you like it, tell me. If you didn't like it, tell me. I'm open for criticism. Again, this is the first time I've even attempted anything like this, and I welcome feedback. I truly do. As always, I am Mr. Island. This has been Pages of Lore from Azeroth. I will see you all next week.